Imagine it rains for 3 days straight where you live. You get annoyed. You complain about the mud, the delayed flight, the canceled plans. Now imagine it doesn't stop after 3 days. It doesn't stop after 3 weeks. It doesn't stop for years. This actually happened. Not once, but many times, long before anyone was around to write it down. And the story of what happened next is stranger than any flood myth you've ever heard. Your ancestors lived through some of the most extreme climate swings this planet has ever produced. Not slow, gentle shifts. Sudden, brutal reversals. One of them turned the driest place on Earth into a landscape of lakes, rivers, and rain that fell almost without pause for thousands of years. Scientists call it the African humid period. You've probably never heard of it, but it shaped who you are today more than almost anything else in human history. Picture the Sahara. Not sand, dunes stretching to the horizon. Not heat shimmering off empty rock. Picture grasslands. Picture hippos wading through shallow lakes. Picture crocodiles sunning themselves on muddy banks hundreds of kilometers from any ocean. This was the Sahara around 11,000 years ago, and it stayed that way for roughly 5,000 years. Rain fell almost constantly. Rivers cut channels through what is now the driest desert on the planet. Why does this matter to you? Because your ancestors were there, and the rain changed everything about how they lived. Geologist Peter Domenical spent years studying ocean floor sediments off the coast of West Africa. Layer by layer, those sediments told a story. Dust blown from a dry Sahara looks different in the seafloor record than dust settled during a wet, vegetated one. What Domenical found shocked him. The wet period didn't fade out slowly. It ended abruptly, almost like a switch flipped, over the span of just 1 or 2 centuries. One moment there was rain, rivers, and green plains. The next, dust storms and desert. Now picture yourself living through the beginning of that wet period. You're used to walking for days across dry, cracked ground to find water. Then the sky changes. Rain starts falling with a regularity you've never seen. At first it feels like a gift. Water everywhere. Grass growing where there's only dust. Animals gathering by streams that didn't exist a generation ago. But here's the uncomfortable question. What do you do when the thing keeping you alive also refuses to stop? Weeks of continuous rain doesn't just mean wet clothes and slower travel. It means rivers overflow. It means the ground you slept on becomes swamp. It means the caves you sheltered in flood from groundwater rising underneath you. Archaeological sites across North Africa show something telling. Settlements from this era cluster near higher ground, near ridgelines, near anything that stayed dry when the lowlands turned to marsh. Your ancestors were not passive victims of the rain. They were reading the land and adapting in real time. This is where a name you might recognize enters the story. Paleoanthropologist Rick Potts of the Smithsonian Institution has spent decades studying how unpredictable climate shaped human evolution itself. His research proposes something called the variability selection hypothesis. In plain English, it means this. Humans didn't evolve to survive one type of environment perfectly. Humans evolved to survive constant, unpredictable change. Drought, then flood. Forest, then grassland. Feast, then famine. The brain that lets you adapt to a new job, a new city, a sudden crisis. That flexibility isn't an accident. It's a direct inheritance from ancestors who lived through exactly this kind of relentless environmental whiplash. Think about that for a second. The ability you have right now to adjust when your plans fall apart. That trait was tested and sharpened by weeks of rain that never seemed to end, by rivers that swallowed campsites, by landscapes that transformed within a single lifetime. Isn't it strange that your patience during a delayed commute is distantly related to a Stone Age ancestor rebuilding shelter after a flood? The rain didn't just reshape geography. It reshaped behavior. As lakes formed across the Sahara, human groups that had been isolated by desert suddenly had pathways to travel. Water routes connected communities that had never met. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests populations spread and mixed across the newly green Sahara during this period, carrying tools, ideas, and traditions with them. The endless rain, in a strange twist, built bridges instead of barriers. But climate scientist Martin Clausen, who modeled the abrupt end of the African humid period, found something that should give you pause. The system wasn't stable. It was balanced on a knife's edge. Small shifts in the Earth's tilt, changes in how sunlight hit the planet, triggered a feedback loop. Less vegetation meant more reflected sunlight. More reflected sunlight meant less rain. Less rain meant even less vegetation. Within a couple of centuries, the same landscape that had sustained thriving communities for millennia turned back into desert. What took thousands of years to build collapsed almost overnight on a geological timescale. Here's the part that should really sit with you. The people who lived through the wet centuries had no way of knowing it would end. There was no warning system, no forecast, no ancient scientists tracking sediment layers. They simply lived generation after generation, assuming the rain and the rivers were permanent. Then, within a lifetime or two, the water vanished. Herds died. Settlements emptied. Entire ways of life disappeared into the sand that swallowed the evidence of them.